According to Fanon, it's not race that creates racism. It's racism that creates race. Race is a socially constructed, arbitrary conception of a certain way of seeing that's a product of racial determinations. But his main point is to focus on where Marx himself did not go on this question, and that is to look at the psychic impact of racism upon the living individual. What does it do to you when you are seen or predetermined in terms of epidermal considerations? What does it do to your sense of self-esteem? What does it do to your sense of your relationships to other people? What does it do to gender relations? What does it do to a sense of your falling into an inferiority complex? And thank you all very much for being able to come out to talk about a great thinker, Frantz Fanon. And I think there's no better time to talk about Fanon's ideas, if for no other reason than his work and his thought is undergoing something of a renaissance today, 50 some odd years after his death in 1961. And that's indicated in various ways. First of all, my book is only one out of 5 new books on Frantz Fanon that have appeared in the last, or about to appear in the last 6 or 8 months. So there's a slew of new studies of Fanon that have hit the shelves, which I had no idea was going to happen when I agreed to write this book about a year and a half ago from Pluto Press. Not only that, but there is a magnificent 600-page collection of Fanon's previously unpublished writings that was issued in France several months ago. These contain mainly his psychiatric writings. As we'll talk about in a minute, he was not only a philosopher and a political activist, but a psychiatrist, and did many clinical studies. These writings were very much unavailable up until now, and they've been published in a book collection along with his correspondence and 2 of his plays, which we had thought were lost, that he wrote as a very young man. He was also a literary person. So this volume is also going to be published by Bloomsbury Press in English translation, and it's probably be out by the end of this year. And plus there's all kinds of other discussions of Fanon that we see popping up all over the place, but not only in academia. What's very interesting is that we see Fanon resurfacing among a new generation of anti-racist activists, especially in the United States, over the course of the last year and a half. And I can give numerous examples of this. Groups like Black Youth Project 100, Assata's Daughters, groups like We Charge Genocide that I've been in contact with in Chicago, who are studying Fanon. And in light of the rampant police abuse, the European refugee crisis, the horrible resurgence of racism that we see so inseparable from this stage of global capitalism as a whole, epitomized probably no more frighteningly than in the US presidential campaign, at least from the Republican side, we're seeing a real resurgence of interest in Fanon, also from grassroots activists, at the same time that we see a resurgence of interest in various academic theoretical studies. So it's a good time to be talking about Fanon. Now, all of this takes place against the backdrop of the exhaustion, I would argue, of a certain way of reading Fanon over the last 30 years. Because it's not like Fanon ever went out of attention at all. He was taught and discussed and argued about more some places than others. Unfortunately, still he's not a very big figure in France, where he lived for a number of years. But again, French society has had a hard time dealing with its colonial and racist past and present. And even in his homeland of the West Indies, he's from Martinique, a French possession in the Caribbean. There's not that much discussion of Fanon as you would think in his homeland. But there's been a lot of discussion in the United States, especially in the academy. But this way of reading Fanon in the academy over the past generation is one that has tended to divest Fanon of some critical elements. His humanism was often seen, and still by some seen, as something of an embarrassment for those in post-colonial theory or in various versions of deconstruction who view humanism as some sort of dirty word. Many others have tried to divest his thought of any direct relationship to the Marxian legacy or Marxist theory. And there's also been many discussions that have just simply ignored the impact upon his life and work of the German philosopher Hegel, the early 19th century philosopher, that Fanon clearly draws upon in his early work, but I argue actually that inheritance runs through all of his writings. Now, why do I start here in discussing Fanon with these kinds of readings of the last 25 years, which frankly didn't get us very far? I think they haven't been very encouraging because they've resulted in various things. One is kind of a manufactured Fanon that is amenable to certain discussions of alterity and difference, don't worry about those words, but that has little to say about how to create a new society or a new humanity that would put an end to the racism that has defined Western civilization for centuries. And related to this, missing in a lot of the discussions of Fanon has been an effort to connect the vision of a new world, of a new socialist humanist humanity, that he actually devoted most of his life to trying to help bring into being. So I wrote this book largely to devote this study to being directed against this kind of misreading of Fanon that we've seen over the last several decades, especially within the academy. That is, my effort or my aim is to try to resituate Fanon in relationship to live populist struggles, mass movements that in Fanon's view were opening the doors not only to rejecting colonialism and rejecting daily practices of racial oppression, but Fanon, these struggles opened the door to creating a transformation on a fundamental interpersonal level of human relationships. That is what he called a new humanism. And I try to argue that that struggle for a new humanism is the unifying thread of all of his work, whether it be as a philosopher, as a playwright, as a political activist, as a psychiatrist, as an ambassador, a roving ambassador for the Algerian Revolution in sub-Saharan Africa, which is what he preoccupied the last 2 years of his life from 1959 to 1961. And I'm trying to reestablish this unifying thread of the struggling for a new humanism that runs through all of Fanon's multidimensional interests, again, not simply for academic purposes, but to explore Fanon's relevance for working out the single most important theoretical and practical question that's facing the left today. And that is working out a viable alternative to capitalism and what has called itself statist socialism over the past 100 years, which we should all know by now has been proven to be a dismal failure. Of course, capitalism is also a dismal failure, but so has established socialism, communism been dismal failures. And what we're faced with is a kind of crisis of the imagination that is being filled by various reactionary currents of thought in lieu of a comprehensive or tangible sense of what is a way to make a transformation of capitalism or a revolution against capitalism that doesn't repeat the kind of horrors that we've seen in the Soviet Union, in communist China, in many other places, or in Africa for that matter, where various regimes came to power that called themselves socialist, but actually simply replicated capitalist relationships under state domination. That, I think, the question, is there an alternative to capitalism, is really, I think, the most burning question we face, whether we're activists or theoreticians, or whether I hope we're both, because we really should be both. That's what it means to really, I think, be a successful activist and a theoretician, is to be both. And yet, that is the hardest question that we're faced with today. It's not an easy thing to figure out. I'm not suggesting that Fanon gives us the answer to this problem or solves the puzzle, but I think that his work, read with eyes of this problem, can allow us to see his relevance in ways that may not otherwise be possible. So basically what I want to do here, and I don't want to talk too long, so I want to leave a lot of time for discussion, is that I want to make an argument, and the argument is as follows. To work out a viable alternative to capitalism, I want to argue here, we need a theoretical view that does two things at the same time. One, goes beyond orthodox Marxism in seeing race and racism as at the inner core of capitalism, which means that the logic of capital cannot be overcome if racism is treated as a secondary or epiphenomenal matter, which unfortunately much of the left has done for decades now. So I want to argue against that view that class comes first in all situations and race is, or gender is somehow secondary or tertiary. I want to argue against that kind of standpoint of traditional Marxism. Secondly, at the same time, I want to argue for the need to go beyond identity politics as it's often been defined, that would tend to see race and racism as, that would deny that race and racism are integrally connected to capitalist relations of production, which means if they're not integrally connected, it would mean that racism could be overcome without negating the logic of capital. I'm trying to argue that that is also a wrong perspective, to separate the question of race from the question of class, or to consider carving out a space of identity that doesn't deal with the broader systemic questions of the nature of capitalism, is also kind of walks us into a dead end. And we've seen a lot of examples of that as well. Now, what I think makes Fanon important, as well as original, frankly, as a thinker, is I think he actually surmounts both standpoints, at least implicitly, and I would try to pull out to see if it can even be posed and stated explicitly. That is, what can we learn about Fanon in terms of developing an alternative to capitalism by looking anew at his relationship to Marxism, looking anew at his relationship to Hegel's philosophy, looking anew at his relationship to the problematic of race and racism and what is really at issue in it. Now, first, let me just therefore say a few words about Marxism. Certainly, I think there's no alternative to capitalism that could possibly be elaborated that's not rooted in some way in Marx's critique of capital. And it's just as clear that Frantz Fanon was not a traditional Marxist. As a matter of fact, it's debatable whether he was a Marxist at all, according to his own self-definition. He certainly never identified with any existing current of Marxism, although he knew about the socialists and he attended socialist meetings in Paris in 47 and 48. He worked with the Communist Youth Group in Paris at certain periods when he was there, earlier and later. And he also associated with many prominent Trotskyist revolutionaries, such as Daniel Guérin. Later on, he became an anarchist as well. He was very close friends with Pierre Brouet. And he was also stayed with Jean Ami's place when he went to France many times, who was Alain Baptiste, leader of a Trotskyist movement, faction within France. He certainly knew all these different radical tendencies, but he never associated explicitly and called himself a follower of any one of them. But as I try to show in my book, Fanon was actually, in some ways, more of a Marxist than the Marxists. And why? So he has a very intriguing phrase in The Wretched of the Earth. He says, when it comes to the colonial situation, and by colonial, we're not just talking about, what France or England or Italy did in Africa, because in many respects, we can think about the black experience in America as a colonial situation that persists right to this day, right? In a certain sense. Fanon makes the comment that when it comes to the colonial situation, and I'm quoting him directly here, the Marxian analysis must be slightly stretched to deal with these realities. Now he says slightly stretched. He doesn't say the Marxian analysis should be abandoned. He doesn't say it should be revised. He doesn't say it should be ignored. So I think we should take him at his word on this, that he was trying to deal with realities that the Marxist tradition had often overlooked, such as the role of the peasantry as more than simply an auxiliary to the working class, a critique of the national bourgeoisie and its relationship to the proletariat, his rejection of a two-stage theory of revolution, which we can go into more in a minute. And on these issues, I think actually we can, I'll try to show in a minute that in some respects, Fanon may be said to be more in tune with Marx than many of Marx's followers. Now, I'll admit this much. If Ernst Laclau and Chante Mouffe were right, as they put it in one of their pieces, that, quote, I'm quoting them, Marx's theory is inherently authoritarian because it cannot escape a class reductionist theory of revolutionary subjectivity, end quote. If they are right about that, then we would need to put Marx aside in having this discussion. But you know what? They're wrong. Very wrong. So just a few words on this. Think about what Marx did right after he published Volume 1 of his greatest theoretical work, Capital, in 1867, which dealt mainly with, of course, the development of capitalism in West Europe and the need to supersede that subsequently, hopefully one day, in a socialist revolution. What does he say after the book comes off the press by the second German edition and then the French edition? First, he denies that he had ever developed a universal theory that's applicable to every society on earth. He said, I never had any such intent to do that, and that's not what I'm doing. You cannot just take my ideas and plug it in to other non-Western societies and act like because England went through this kind of trajectory to go from feudalism to capitalism and hopefully one day to socialism, that applies to the non-Western world. Secondly, he specifically limited his delineation of the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation to West Europe alone. And third, in his late writings on Russia and elsewhere, he emphasized the possibility that these non-Western underdeveloped societies could get to socialism without having to go through capitalist industrialization. They can skip this phase of capitalism, this phase of bourgeois dominance, which existed in the West, if, of course, two things happened. One, these developing societies relied on their indigenous communal formations, especially in the countryside, which Marx viewed as kind of proto-socialist. And secondly, if, based on a peasant revolution, to both preserve those communal formations and to push back the powers of imperialism or the state in trying to destroy them, if that peasant revolution linked up with worker struggles in the West, Marx held that could mean that a place like Russia could get to a communist future, he said, ahead of Western Europe. This is what he wrote in the last year of his life. Now, my point here is that when you look at Marx's work, you find that he was not simply adopting some formula that he extracts from his earlier work in studying Europe and then says, okay, let me paste it onto the rest of the developing world because after all, I've found the golden key to answer all questions universally. He was breaking with that kind of formalistic approach. And instead, basically what Marx was saying, you have to grasp the dialectic of the thing that is in front of you. And you have to, as it were, be open to new developments and rethink from the beginning as if from day one, every time a new fundamental phenomena confronts you. And you can't simply apply the conclusions from another context to this new problem that you're dealing with. Now, I think this is exactly what Frantz Fanon did when it came to having to deal with his own life experience. He's growing up in Martinique. It's a very racially divided society where the Becks, the whites, control 5% of the population that control all the economic and political power. He is disgusted with this kind of situation. He ends up moving to France to study philosophy and ultimately psychiatry. He finds that French society is even more racist than what he experienced back home in Martinique. He then wants to go to sub-Saharan Africa and work as a psychiatrist in Senegal, but Leopold Senghor never answered his letter. So he ends up in Algeria, not knowing that he's walking right into the middle of what turns out to become the birth of the Algerian revolutionary movement against French colonialism that lasts for the next 8 years and leads to the death at the hands of the French of 1 million Algerians. It's one of the greatest massacres in 20th century, the French effort to put down this liberation movement. But what Fanon does in trying to deal with the realities of his lived situation as a black man is to think about, okay, here's what Marx was doing for his particular time and place, but I'm in a different time and in a different place, so I've got to do something that is adequate to my moment, even though I'm going to learn as much as I can from him. So what specifically was that? You see, Fanon's brilliance is not to stop at Marx. He does absorb Marx's insight that racism is fundamentally a product of economic determinants. Okay? We can look at this in terms of the slave trade that initially gave birth, of course, to anti-black racism. It's only been around about 500-600 years in the West. It's a rationale for an economic imperative. Slavery. We can also talk, by the way, about the economic determinants that also structured the emergence of European anti-Semitism. And Fanon always talked about anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, and anti-black hatred as being on parallel tracks, although they're very different realities. We can take that up in discussion if you want to hear more about it. But what Fanon also sees is that while racism may owe its origins to economic, political determinations, you can't stop there, because racism takes on a life of its own and over time structures our way of seeing each other without us being even aware of it, such that it sinks into our psyche, it sinks into our soul, and it predetermines how we see each other. How we see each other is actually structured in such a way that we internalize this racialist categories. And as a result of this racism that we internalize, we then begin to think of each other in terms of race instead of who we are as individual human beings. So, as I had said yesterday in another talk, according to Fanon, it's not race that creates racism. It's racism that creates race. Race is a socially constructed, arbitrary conception of a certain way of seeing that's a product of racial determinations. But his main point is to focus on where Marx himself did not go on this question, and that is to look at the psychic impact of racism upon the living individual. What does it do to you when you are seen or predetermined in terms of epidermal considerations? What does it do to your sense of self-esteem? What does it do to your sense of your relationships to other people? What does it do to gender relations? What does it do to a sense of your of falling into an inferiority complex? These are the issues that Fanon was very interested in, and I think he's stretching the Marxian analysis to take it into this area.